I'm mad. I'm angry. I'm ticked off. I'm mad that my dad has died. I was angry when he got cancer. I was angry when it robbed him of his strength so fast. I'm ticked off that he only got 2 months to fight it. I'm ticked off that he only got 66 years on this earth. I'm mad. On Saturday morning, right after Dad died, I saw a car with a bumper sticker that said, "Cancer sucks." And I agree. Cancer sucks. Death sucks. I hate death. I hate that it took my dad, and I'm as mad as hell. I loved my dad. If I can say it from a strictly human perspective, colored by a son's perception, my dad was a very good man. He had a gruff exterior. He didn't care too much for touchy-feely things or sentimentality. We weren't huggers. But that's not because he didn't care. It's because he cared too much. I remember Grandpa and Grandma's 50th wedding anniversary. He tried to get up and say something, just something simple about how much he appreciated his mom and dad, how much he loved them, and nothing would come out. He just couldn't talk. Anytime he tried to talk about how he felt, he ended up crying. I think Dad was shocked to find out I wanted to preach at his funeral because he couldn't imagine doing this. So in his own way, my dad was a big softy, and I'm mad that he's gone. Dad had an especially soft spot in his heart for hard luck cases. He loved to help people who were in a tough spot. Whether it was helping a friend check into rehab, or helping a single mom pay some bills, or giving somebody a second chance with a job, Dad was always helping somebody who needed help. In fact, I don't even think we kids know half as much about the people Dad helped. I remember when I still lived at home, sometimes the phone would ring and I'd answer it and the voice wouldn't be familiar and I wouldn't know the name, and I'd say to Mom, "Who was that?" And Mom would say, "Well, that's just somebody your dad's helping." I know that some of you here today are people Dad helped. And now he's died. That ticks me off. My dad didn't suffer fools lightly. He was a big believer in common sense, and that made my decision to become a preacher an interesting one. Because as a class, Dad generally regarded preachers as lacking in common sense. And don't get me wrong, Dad loved the church. He loved the Lord. He respected each and every one of his pastors as teachers of the Bible and spiritual advisors. It's just that when it came to leadership and the business side of the church, Dad he felt like seminary did something to us. He felt we preachers tended towards the more complicated, out-of-touch answers when something a little bit more simple and straightforward would generally do. And I think that's what made him a good deacon. But knowing that about my dad, it made it interesting the day that I told him, felt called to become a preacher. And I could see the look on his face, like, oh, son, don't be a fool. But he supported me. He encouraged me every step of the way. And I've got to say that since I became a pastor, my best conversations about strategy, about leadership in the church, have been with my dad. He was always my best source of advice. Because he took my tendency to complicate things and be out of touch, and he forced me to apply a little common sense. For the last 12 years, I've rarely made a leadership decision without wondering what Dad would think about it. And now he's gone, and I'm not going to be able to ask him for advice anymore. And that makes me mad. Cancer sucks. Death sucks. I hate death. And you know what? I think Jesus hates death too. I'd like to take a few moments to consider a Bible story with you. It's a wonderful story. It's one of my favorites. The first time I ever spoke at a memorial service, this is the story I used. It's the story of Jesus and Lazarus. It's told in John 11, verses 17 through 44. It says this: on his arrival, Jesus found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Bethany was less than 2 miles from Jerusalem, and many Jews had come to Martha and Mary to comfort them in the loss of their brother. And when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him, but Mary stayed at home. Lord, Martha said to Jesus, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha answered, I know he will rise again in the resurrection at the last day. And Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Yes, Lord, she told him. I believe that you're the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. And after she had said this, she went back and called her sister Mary aside. The teacher is here, she said, and he's asking for you. And when Mary heard this, she got up quickly and went to him. Now Jesus had not yet entered the village, but was still at the place where Martha had met him. And when the Jews who had been with Mary in the house comforting her noticed how quickly she got up and went out, they followed her, supposing she was going to the tomb to mourn her. And when Mary reached the place where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet and said, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. And when Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who had come along with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled. Where have you laid him? He asked. Come and see, Lord, they replied. And Jesus wept. And then the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying? And Jesus, once more deeply moved, came to the tomb. And it was a cave with a stone laid across the entrance. Take away the stone, he said. But Lord, said Martha, the sister of the dead man, by this time there is a bad odor, for he's been there 4 days. And then Jesus said, did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God? And so they took away the stone. And then Jesus looked up and said, Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I said this for the benefit of people standing here, that they may believe that you sent me. And when he had said this, Jesus called in a loud voice, Lazarus, come out. And the dead man came out. his hands and feet wrapped with strips of linen and a cloth around his face. And Jesus said to them, "Take off the grave clothes and let him go." There are two things I want to talk about from this story. First, Jesus hates death. Death made Jesus angry. And I say that because of what happened when Jesus stood with Mary outside of Lazarus' tomb. I say that because of the shortest verse in the Bible. You know, the one we all got the gold star on in Sunday school when it was assigned as memory work. John 11, verse 35. Jesus wept. Now, let me ask you a question. Why would Jesus weep? Why do you suppose Jesus cried that day? I mean, I understand the situation was ripe for tears. Everybody around him was carrying on with weeping and wailing. One of his best friends was standing right in front of him, broken. Another of his best friends was lying in a tomb, dead. I get that the whole production was set up for weeping. But consider what Jesus already knew. He knew that he was about to raise Lazarus from the dead. He knew that 4 days earlier when the messenger first came to tell him that Lazarus was sick. And he said, this sickness is not unto death. He knew it 2 days later when he told the disciples it was time to go and see Lazarus, to wake him up from his sleep. He knew it when he talked to Martha and told her, "Your brother will rise again." So what's going on? If Jesus knew he was about to call Lazarus out of the grave, why does he weep? I think John gives us a clue. Just a few verses earlier, in verse 33, he writes, "When Jesus saw Mary weeping and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in spirit and troubled." That expression, deeply moved in spirit, comes from a Greek word which describes the sound a horse makes when it's angry. It's almost a snort of indignation. It's a release of air from the body in such a way that it expresses outrage. In other words, Jesus was angry. He was angry not at Mary and the others for crying, but angry that they needed to cry at all. Jesus was ripped, snorting mad about death. That's why he burst into tears in verse 35, because Jesus hates death. He sees it and he's deeply moved in his spirit. He hates how it leads to grief and a sense of loss. He hates how it rips